Okay, looks like we are live, everybody. Let me get this started. All right. Hello, everybody. Happy Thursday. Welcome to another camera class. For those of you who are new, welcome. For those of you who've done this a couple times, welcome as well. My name is Saxon. I am your camera host. I've been teaching this class for probably a little over 2 years now. But today is the second Thursday of the month, so it's intermediate cameras. Let me get this flipped over. So intermediate, I'm taking you from the very bare bones that we've talked about for the last class. The first class, we tried to keep it on the automatic setting, and we learned from there. We start with learning the bare bones, the basics, and we progressively move up until we've got more of a understanding of it without getting into manual control. The whole point of last class was to learn the automatic settings of the camera, let the camera do the work for us. We're there just to take a pretty photo. We talk about lenses, and we talk a little bit about content creation. Now we want to get away from all of that. We no longer want to do automatic controls. We want to start doing manual controls. We want to use the camera as a tool, as it's intended to be used, which is for us to get the best picture possible with the various amounts of different settings and controls that the camera has. What we're going to do is go through each of the different controls: aperture, ISO, and shutter. Talk about how they're different, how they're similar. We're going to look at some of the other important things you should be aware of when playing with your camera settings and controls. And lastly, we're going to take some images that I have on these slides, and we're going to actually go through, and I'm going to tell you what the aperture, ISO, and shutter are, and what I would guesstimate them to be based on what I'm seeing in the photo. So without further ado, let's jump in. So why do we go advanced with the point and shoot, DSLR, or mirrorless cameras? What is the point of doing that? The thought process behind that is going to be the fact that our camera is going to give us the ability to control and manipulate various different settings. What the camera does automatically is fantastic, and if you're shooting on mirrorless and the newer technology, it does a great job. But where we don't necessarily see the boost in the photos is without the manual control. It's without us doing the manipulation of the whole photograph and going through and changing the dials and rearranging things. We lose a lot of information in our photo that could be better if we knew how to do that. So what I propose today is taking our basic photos and we're going to make them better. That's what we're really looking at today. And I like to think of that as something that's a snapshot versus a photograph. What's a snapshot? A snapshot can be done on automatic. It can be done on manual too, but really the idea behind it is that it's a quick photo. We're not taking a photo that's necessarily prestigious, award-winning, perfect, not flawed. What we're doing is we're taking a photo that is quick. It's easy. It's meant to be fast on the trigger. Where a photograph comes into it is that there's more thought process. So this photo I have here uses the same camera in both the two examples I have. This is the snapshot I took with my camera. This is the photograph I took with my camera. Now you might be saying, how did you change from one to the other? Well, I looked at things like my focus parameters, and I made sure that I had a center single point focus. I made sure that my ISO was at a 400 level. I think I even brought it down to 200 as well too, to keep it dark, so that way it was low lit. Using my camera's ability for low light photography, I was able to use that low lit situation to still pull out and take out light that was available to me. From there, I was able to set my shutter at about 1/100th of a second, which keeps it low and slow, so it takes in more light. It's not as fast. I was able to switch my white balance color, so that way things stood out and popped a little bit more, including that purple tone that we're getting from the Hancock building in the slide. But really what we're looking at is I was able to manipulate my camera's settings and functions to get a photo that looked better, that looked like this, as opposed to a photo that looked more like this. And that's what I'm hoping we can get out of today's class. Really what we're trying to do is learn how to go from a photo that looked like the one before, and how do we get it to look like something like this. And that's what I'm hoping I can teach you guys and show you guys today. Alright, so back into it. Step one, as we talked about last week, is to learn your camera. Your camera is your first line of defense. It's the piece of equipment that does all the work for you. It truly is the best camera there, or it's truly the best way to get started as a whole. The second you learn how to use your camera, the world is your oyster. There's features, there's controls, there's functions. There's all sorts of stuff that you can learn and master as time goes. But as long as you know where to find them and where they're located within your camera, it's an amazing start to this whole operation. Now the next thing we're going to talk about is the mode dial. We talked about this last week, but what is the mode dial exactly? It's your camera's driving mechanism. It's like your car. When you're in the car, you have your gear shift. You switch from neutral to park to reverse to 1 to 2 to anything, to whatever's there, I should say. Your camera's mode dial is no different. It's your ability to switch from manual to automatic to program auto to shutter to aperture, whatever it is that you're trying to do. If you were here last week or you've been shooting for a while, automatic and program automatic are the two ones you should start with always. Automatic, you are pointing the camera and taking a pretty photo. There's not much else to it and not too much of a complication behind that. Program auto, now you're getting more technical. Now you can control things like ISO, exposure compensation, what your focus parameter is, what your white balance is, your burst mode, your target recognition, stuff that might not make sense to you now, but as you practice and learn will. But automatic and program auto are the same thing. There's just more that you can actually manipulate in program auto that gets you more towards manual control. But the three most important ones that we're looking at today are aperture priority, shutter priority, and the full manual control. Aperture priority is just control over aperture. Everything else is auto. Shutter is only control over the shutter of the camera, and that then means everything else is automatically controlled. And then lastly, you have full manual, which takes both aperture and shutter, combines them together, and now everything is manually controlled. You are the one that dictates and decides what is what. We call something like this the exposure triangle. Now I'm showing it off like this because I like to do it in the chart form. But this is a great way of just showing off all three of the different types of things that we're talking about. Aperture, shutter, ISO. A lot of the times you'll see this cheat card or this type of chart listed as a pyramid. And while that's fine, I think that what gets misconstrued with the pyramid style is that when this one changes, you got to change this one to match. And that's not necessarily true. All three of these functions can function separate from each other, but they control a major aspect of the camera that when mixed together helps you get the perfect photo possible. We're going to talk about how all three of these live separately, but how they interact with one another when you think about it. So let's start off with our aperture priority. Now what is aperture? The way that aperture works is that it is the metal kind of metal leaf shutters that go back and forth that at a large size let in more light and at a smaller size let in less light. The best way to think about this is that photography requires light. Without light, we don't get photography. So light is a must. But within photography, we control how much light comes into our camera. And we have two ways to really do that. Three ways, but the two main ways that we're looking at first are aperture and shutter. Aperture dictates it by making the circle bigger or smaller. Now, they have a maximum aperture number, which is going to be the smallest number possible on your aperture ring. In this case on the chart, we go from f1.4 to 22. So our maximum aperture for this is 1.4. At the 1.4, you're going to notice we don't see a background. And at f22, we see a perfect background behind our stick figure. Not only does aperture basically say how much light is coming into the camera, aperture also dictates how we can separate the foreground from the background of the image. In this case scenario, we have a stick figure standing in front of the pyramids. At f22, which is a minimal amount of light that's coming into the camera, we can see both the background and the foreground together up close. That creates a flatter image, but lets us get a picture of both our subject and the background in perfect clarity. At f1.4, we no longer have a background. It's blurred out completely. All you see is a stick figure, and without the remnants that list on this chart, you probably wouldn't be able to figure out what exactly that background is. Here's some examples of how we would put this into the wild. Let's start with our left example, the dog's nose. If we look at how close that dog's nose is in our foreground, and we see how blurred out the background is, by using this image, we can consult our chart and figure out exactly what aperture this might be. Now, this is a perfect example of why we might use aperture. There's so much detail and information on the dog's nose. You can see the wrinkles, the hair follicles, even a little bit of moisture that's either coming from the nose or the saliva that the dogs have. That being said, we might want to capture those finer details, and we might want to blur the background out as to not distract the viewer from the entire image. It's so much easier to show the dog's nose up close than it is to have everything else going on in the image, especially if the main point of this image was the dog's nose. Now, if we compare this to the chart, I'd say that's probably an f8 to 5.6. We can tell that the background is still the pyramids, but we don't necessarily see the finer details like we would in the 16 or the 22. So I'd probably say f8 or f5.6 for the dog on the left. Now with the squirrel, it's a little different. We got the squirrel in the foreground, but the background is completely blurred out. Why we would do something like this, we just want to focus on the squirrel. We don't need the background of this image. We as the photographer have decided that the background is boring and that the squirrel sitting on a log or sitting on a tree branch eating something is more interesting. So this would probably be more the 1.4, maybe even f-stop 2, f2, f1.4, for how much the background is blurred out and we have our focus on our subject matter. Another thing to keep in mind, that the higher the number goes, so the closer we are to f22, the deeper the image is. The background and the foreground, being our puppy, being our dog, are in focus. You'll also notice that on the deep side, everything's darker. The colors are much less vibrant, as opposed to shallow, where we've blurred the background out. The green is a little lighter, the dirt has a little bit more color to it, but our dog's fur, it's the same dog, same placement, but now that fur is lighter because of how much color, how much less, or how much more light is coming from the image as a whole. So f-stop not only controls how much background to foreground relationship we have, but aperture also controls how dark or light the image is because of how much light we're letting in through that tiny view hole that we have, if that makes sense. And by all means, as you guys are listening and watching, please feel free to chat. They're live chats. I'll see them right away, and then I'll let you, I'll comment or read those aloud for you guys. Why would we use aperture priority? Again, that's something to think about with this. I like this photo to kind of sum that up. This is a beautiful scenery shot. You've got gorgeous water, the cloud, or there's not a cloud in the sky, it's a little overcast. The sunset that's happening, this is beautiful orange, yellow, and red with a little bit of purple on the top. You've got the water, the rocks. Then you have this lady standing in front. That could be your sister, your wife, your cousin, your niece, maybe your granddaughter, daughter, whoever it might be, your friend. This is a perfect example. If they wanted a clean picture of just themselves, a portrait shot, they look nice, they look like they're in a good pose, you could take that picture and do something like an f1.4 to blur that background out. But being conscious of how beautiful this background is and the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that this photo might be to the taker of the photo, you might want to leave it at f22, f16. Allow the light that is there to saturate your camera and to get a beautiful picture of both the subject and the background without having to blur or without having to sacrifice. Aperture priority might be the best way for you as the artist to do that, because you can dictate how much of the background and foreground you're actually going to use and keep in focus. The rest of it you can blur out. And by using aperture priority mode, the camera itself will allow for changes to happen through itself. It'll dictate whether or not it needs more ISO or a faster or slower shutter to give you a clearly legible result. That's the best part about aperture priority. All you're doing is controlling the aperture and nothing else. Now let's look at shutter priority as the next step. What is shutter? Shutter is the movement of the shutters on the inside of the camera to capture your image. They move at a speed of less than or up to or exceeding a second. So when you look at this chart, anything that says 1 500ths or 1 250ths, that goes by seconds. So it's 1 500th of a second. 1 250ths of a second. In this case, when we look at this chart, the person, the stick figure in this case, is running. They're moving. The faster we set the shutter, the better we are to capturing that image. The slower we set the shutter, the more chances we have to getting a blurry image. And you might be asking, why then would we even set our shutter slow? Why not just keep it fast all the time? Well, the more information our camera is able to take in if we have a slower shutter. For still lifes or for nature where things aren't moving quickly or fast at all, or even at all, if you're taking pictures of rocks, you might want to do a slower shutter. This will allow for you to do things like get more clarity on the image, pick up more information like details, lighting, exposure, vibrancy. This might also let you get what we call deeper or long exposure shots, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But the reason that we have this ability to change the shutter is that the faster our shutter goes, the less light that's being let into the camera. The slower our shutter goes, the more light that comes into the camera. Much like aperture, the bigger the circle, the more light. The smaller the circle, the less light. Shutter works in the same ballpark. Now, just like aperture priority just controls aperture, shutter priority is only controlling the speed at which the camera is closing and opening. We need shutter for things like action. If you've got kids or family or friends or anything that's involved in sports, recreational activities, things that can maybe acquire movement, and you want to capture pictures of that, well, your aperture priority might not give you enough. Your ability to do manual control or automatic control might not give you enough. Learning how to control how fast your camera fires is what's really going to set you above and beyond when it comes to this. The surfer that's moving, right now the water's whipping them around. They're not in the air for that long, but the few seconds they are in the air, using something like 1 1,000th of a speed or faster will ensure that you capture that information. Looking around, you can see how sunny of a day to be outside, to be surfing. So the sun is going to help bring in more light to your camera, which should then within that, help the speed because of how fast you're going. The more light, the more bright your photo will look, even though you're doing it so fast that it's preventing light from coming in. Exactly. So, with what you're saying, slow shutter is amazing for astrophotography, artistic, absolutely. That being said, you probably would set your aperture to something like a 1.4 or maybe a 2 to do something like that. That's making your hole real small, that aperture real small, so not a lot of light's coming in. So then it's perfect. You set up your longer exposures. That'll then help more light come into the photo, which gives you beautiful detailed shots. In astrophotography, PyPic 12, one of my favorite things is when you do long exposures and then you allow for that travel of the stars. Even if it's only a couple seconds and you get that exposure, they can be gorgeous photos. And there's tons of people online who will teach you how to take beautiful astrophotography if that's something you guys are interested in doing. But shutter priority, whether you're using it in the manual control or you're using shutter by itself, two big things is freezing action and that then the slower photography, the actual long exposures. One thing I do notice people who do play with shutter priority or have the ability to look at something like this, they get scared of blur or of anything that shows motion. But I want to make sure that we understand, don't be afraid to try a little bit of blur in your photo. This is a shot that was done on burst. They did 10 frames within a second on their burst photography on their camera that they had. I can't remember off the top of my head. But this is the one they got, and they were frustrated about the movement on the wing. And one of the things I said was that this photo is beautiful, the color is gorgeous, there's a lot of motion, activity. That's not something to be ashamed of. The birds like this, like the woodpeckers if I'm not mistaken, they're fast, they're quick. Getting one where it's perfectly slow motion is very difficult to get. But the blur on the wings really does show the movement of this bird. Mix that in with the fact that you can see the bug in the beak. The beak has such a bright red, pink, and orange color. Now you move into the body of the bird and you have this mustardy, yellow, browns, the greens, a little tint of blue as well too, mixed in with the browns. You got a really beautiful color scheme going on this. And that motion, you can definitely tell that this isn't a fake bird. This is a bird that caught a bug in midair and was traveling at a very fast speed. So don't be afraid of blur. Don't be afraid of experimenting with the faster shutter speeds because it'll help you capture a lot of the image. Will it all be perfect? Maybe not, but maybe. But don't be afraid of a little bit of blur. It will not hurt your photos. Now going into what PyPic 12 was saying, long exposures, slower shutters. They help create mood, they help draw out color, they really help things pop. This is a great example of something that has motion to it, yet with that longer exposure, it stayed alive for a little bit longer, and it has beautiful color and saturation and vibrancy in all corners. This is a waterfall that's falling in the same area. That's why you can see such kind of developed water patterns. That you will see a little bit of blur around where the water splashes because that is unpredictable. But this beautiful halo effect happens from this water because let's say that this shutter was left open for 4 seconds, 5 seconds at the max. That water is continuously falling in the same exact place. The rocks, the moss, the green, it's all in the same place, maybe moving slightly via a breeze. But for the most part, the camera is able to take in all this information for that long period of time. And with that, you're able to differentiate the areas of green within the plants. The ones that are alive, dead, fresh, meant to be cut, brand new, have been there for a minute because they're so dark. Then you get the moss where it blends in with the rocks in certain areas. But when you look really closely, you can see the texture and the difference between the darks and those black colors. They don't just mix together, they are all separate in their own entities. And that's because you're able to do a longer exposure and and it helped bring that pop of color, that texture, that vibrancy, all from not doing a fast shutter, but doing a slow shutter. Now, all that seems like a lot. I know it's not easy to really talk about, and it's one of those things, do I expect everyone to get this off the bat? No. But I like these little charts because I think it dumbs it down, for lack of a better term, explains it easily for those of you who are brand spanking new to this and you have no idea what you're doing. Remember that the faster we set the shutter speed, the better of a chance we have to freeze motion. The slower the shutter speed, the blurrier the motion becomes. But on the flip side of that, the faster we set our shutter, the darker the image gets, and the slower we set the shutter, the brighter the image becomes. And again, the reason that being is that you have your sensor open for a longer period of time. It can collect more information, therefore it makes a brighter image. The faster it shuts, the less time it has to collect, so the darker the image will become. Now, when you're doing things like shutter priority by itself, all you're controlling is the speed. I had a mother send this photo to me, or I think it was a mother or a girlfriend. She thought we sold her a bad camera. I had to explain to her that what she was doing wasn't necessarily enough. She was using automatic in downtown Chicago while her boyfriend or kid or whoever it was playing ultimate frisbee. And she explained to me how by doing this, like, she just couldn't get it right, and what could she do? And I recommended shutter priority because everything else is automatic. All you're doing is saying, wow, these kids or these people are moving that fast with what they're doing. Let me turn the speed up so I'm able to freeze that motion. On the flip side of this, though, let's say you are using the manual control. Well, this is where now aperture and shutter, the two most important controlled settings on our camera, now feed off of each other. We'll talk a little bit about that in the manual section when I get there. But why use shutter priority? You might be in an area where instead of you being focused on the foreground to background separation, you're concerned at which the speed at the objects you're taking photos of are moving. This could be your kid's baseball. This could be a day at the park. I know that they got the boat races that come up at the Navy Pier coming up soon. If you're from Chicago or Illinois, you might want to go see those. That's where then using things that have controlled speed variation, like shutter priority, would benefit your photography, in my opinion. Now, the last thing to look at that's part of this exposure triangle is ISO. If any of you are old enough to have used film back in the day, you'd remember that your film came with a number written on the box. I picked up, actually, because I still shoot with film every once in a while, picked up a box of Kodak 400. Kodak 400 is a 400 ISO film. What does ISO stand for? It's a very long and technical term that I always forget, but what it stands for really is the sensitivity your film has towards light. Now you might be asking, why does that matter when I have things like shutter and aperture to worry about? Now you're telling me there's a third thing. Well, the nice part with ISO is that there's no one wrong answer for ISO, and there's no one right answer for it. ISO determines the sensitivity towards your sensor. The larger the number is for ISO, the more sensitive it is, the more light it takes in. And the lower the number is, the less sensitive it is, the less amount of light that it takes in. And you can see that on there. Here's another chart to show that. It's a dark, overcast day. Probably something at that 800 or 1600 would be enough to get that shadow, that light rain, that overcast quality is kind of mitigated, and we can really see the color of this situation that we're taking the photo of. Whereas 100 isn't enough because it's just too dark outside and it's leading the photo to be on the darker side. If you are someone shooting with a DSLR, which a lot of you might be, still in that DSLR mode, noise is something that you've got to be worried about. Noise doesn't necessarily exist on the mirrorless cameras. Now, what does really exist on mirrorless is going to be that ability to go from too light to too dark, but these sensors have changed so much that you might still see noise if you're not on the right number, but it's very less likely as compared to the DSLR days. But ISO and noise go hand in hand. If you set your ISO up to be too high for the setting that you're in, you'll get what's called noise, and it'll feel like the TV static. If you do too little, your image should just be too dark and unseeable. So keep that in mind when you're taking photos. Again, I've shot with so many different cameras nowadays. I have 4 in my collection at the current moment between all the different brands that are out there. Honestly, if I'm being real with you, I don't think that you necessarily need to worry too much about the noise nowadays with the cameras. But I do think that you should be particularly, keep in mind the ISO as you're going. There are ways to go too much of it, and you'll notice how bleached or watered out or washed out your photos are, as opposed to too little where it's just too dark, not enough. Automatic ISO. I'm going to sit here and I'm going to tell you right now, I am a huge fan of auto ISO. I think that auto ISO works 99% of the time. Where it doesn't work, though, are, I would say, controlled environments. Now, this is something to keep in mind. Yes. So what PyPic 12 is also saying there too. Many people are too afraid of the noise. Editing software also allows to fix later, and that's huge. I think that we do take advantage of editing software and don't really understand. I don't think we appreciate it as the tool that it is, right? 80% of the photo, or I'd even say 90% of the photo, is up to us to take. We control it, we manipulate it via the camera and the tools that we have. That extra 10 to 20% is done online, and it's really amazing what some of these tools can do. Even if you're not using a system like Photoshop that's got AI built into it, certain things like Pix Pro or Affinity Photo, Corel Photo, or Corel Paint Shop Pro, these programs are designed to help us really help clean the photos up. Noise is something to be afraid of, but I will say that in my experience with the newer technology, the mirrorless technology, there isn't too many times where I'm afraid of it. It's more of just, do I get a washed out photo, or too dark of a photo, and am I able to fix it with exposure compensation later on when I get into the post fixing or the post of the photos. We talk a little bit more with the post next week when we get into advanced photography, and I talk a little bit more about editing and the simple basic tools that you might want to think about when editing. But to keep it back onto this, auto ISO I think is something that with the newer technology is fantastic. 10 years ago, if you would have asked me about it, I would have had maybe a little more hesitation towards it, and I would have told you to set your ISO based on the light you're reading. This was also around the time when I was using light readers constantly to figure out what I saw as the light was coming into my camera. Nowadays, I do trust the mirrorless technology. But I had a mother come in who, her kids were about to go to prom, and with prom there were all these photo shoots that she had to go do. She had to do one at one person's house, and they wanted to get one at this one country club that the parents of this one kid were involved in. There's a lot of technical moving around. But I told her that auto ISO might be a good idea for her to use because she'll be bouncing in between areas with lots of light and areas with not a lot of light. For this room, for example, where I'm teaching, which I'm in a small box on your screen, but if you can imagine it, I have about 8 feet ceilings here that have canned recessed lighting that push it up to probably about 8.5 feet off where the ground is. The lights I have in here are a higher Kelvin number, making the lights more orangey, yellowy, which gives off a warmer tone. All that being said, that affects the final product of our photo. And that being said, ISO plays a huge point in that because of how much light is in here, how much light my camera needs to set itself to, or sensitivity-wise set itself to, in order to then produce the right image. So what I'm basically saying here is, auto ISO is a great thing to have turned on, and if you're someone who's experienced with setting your ISO when you're shooting all the time, absolutely. You know your camera the best if you've been using and practicing with it. If you're brand new to this, Auto ISO is not a bad thing, and no one who is a professional photographer would really probably come after you about something like this, nor would they make you feel a certain type of way. So, my opinion, auto ISO, use it if you're inexperienced, use it if you're super experienced, and you just want to make sure that your camera is doing the heavy lifting for you. Just to review one more time so everyone's on the same page. F-stop. F-stop controls your foreground to background relationship. The higher the number, the more you can see both the foreground and the background in perfect clarity. The lower the number, the more blurred out things become, the more that you lose the background in favor of the foreground to keep your subject matter in focus. In that same realm though, the higher the number, the less light comes into the camera. The lower the number in aperture, the more light comes into the camera. Flip-flop it a little bit with shutter speed. Shutter speed is going to be the ability to stop and freeze action. The higher the number, the more of a chance we have to slow down the image in high speed. The lower the number, the more blur we're going to have if that object is still traveling at the same speed, faster, or even slower. That's where we have to then decide what the number is. That being said, the lower the number, the lighter the images can be because we have more of a chance for long exposure. The higher the number is, the more chance that we're going to get for darker images because we're not letting a lot of light in. And then ISO is the very last one that I have on here. The lower the number, the less sensitive towards light that our camera is. The higher the number, the more chance for noise or a washed out photo or unrecognizable photo we're going to have because we're not letting enough light into the camera, or we're letting too much light into the camera, which is now giving us this kind of textured, noisy, blurry, pixelated image, or giving us a washed out image. On the flip side of ISO though, too little ISO, and we get a dark, overly saturated image that doesn't give us enough info either. Now, to bring in a few more things that I think are important to this whole thing before I then talk about full manual, let's talk about the exposure meter. When all else fails, you've set your ISO, you've set your shutter, you've set your aperture, and it still looks too dark, too light. There should be a dial on your camera called exposure compensation or exposure meter. And typically it'll be a plus and minus symbol in a yin-yang style box. But positive numbers will be plus, they'll raise the exposure, making it brighter. Negative numbers, the little minus sign, will lower the exposure, making it darker. Typically you'll see one stop on there, half stops depending on the camera that you have. My camera will do quarter stops in between each full stop, and that's my Nikon. And then on my Sony, I think it does full stops and half stops, but I'm not 100% sure. Light metering. So we talked about ISO and how that is your camera's sensor's ability to read the light in the area and then dictate how it's going to use it. This goes a little further. So this takes the light that it senses and meters it, so that way it gives an effect on the sensor. So multi-evaluative, multi-segment, matrix, all these companies call it that a little bit different, but it looks at light from all over the sensor. It takes light from everywhere and helps bring that balance in. That's what then helps your camera dictate things like ISO and exposure. So multi should be the standard one your camera is. That's the whole square, the whole image. Center, center weighted, average. That is going to be your camera's ability to read the center of the image. What's coming directly from it and what's radiating off of it. I like to think about a candle. If you light a candle, the light that comes from the candle is one aspect. Turn the lights off in the room though, now you see that glow that comes off the candle light. And you can see how it kind of quivers and goes back and forth. That's the perfect way of thinking center. If you were to light a candle, turn the lights off in your room, and it was pitch black except for that candle, you're going to get the light, but you're also going to get a little bit of light that radiates off of it. And that's what the center is going to do. Whereas spot, which looks similar, only does that center portion, nothing else. Some cameras will let you move the spot around, some don't. I, for the most part, have never moved mine, but I know that certain models you can. And then there's also the partial or entire screen average. That's from Canon and Sony. Again, it's all different on what they have, and it's nice to experiment with it. But this is light metering is a great way to play with how light comes into the camera and how your camera's internal brain is dictating it. You can then help position it so you get maybe a little bit more of what you want out of the image. That picture I showed at the beginning of my class where I said the difference between snapshot and photograph, I use center weighted for my light metering, and that helped pull and make that kind of darker hue around my image, which I really liked. I thought it looked artistic. White balance presets, I won't sit here and read all of these to you, but let's sum this up. Light is measured by its temperature, at least in what we're looking at right now for white balance. The larger the number is, the cooler it gets, the more dead it becomes, right? Shade, cold. Daylight fluorescent lights, cold. Cloudy feels cold. That stark white flash, colder. Now when you get to direct sunlight, it starts to feel warm. And that's when you start to see that sun going down and setting or rising. It starts to get warm to cold. And as you keep moving, you start to get warmer and warmer and warmer. And that's where you can go from that red to blue within the light spectrum. In our camera, we're able to set the balance between those presets on there via the settings that are there. Now we can also do this in post, which is really nice. But again, for so many of us out there, we want to take photos and we don't want to necessarily go back in and edit these photos and manipulate stuff. We're not here for that. We're here to take clean photos, maybe post them, share them with friends and family. Who knows what we're doing with these pictures, but they're for us to take. Some of us don't want to sit there and edit and do things. Some of us just want to take photos and move from there. So keep that in mind. All of these things, or white balance at least, you can change within editing your photo, but you can also manipulate it on the camera settings so that way it's like that right when you start shooting. Now, everything I mentioned can be accessed between aperture and shutter priority. But if you want the full, true creator-like experience, full manual control, that M on your camera, some people dread the M, some people absolutely love the M. There it is. That is your automatic manual control over the whole thing. You no longer are allowing the camera to do anything for you unless you specify. In manual control, you can still let ISO be automatic. You can let white balance and some of these other features be automatic. But that shutter and that aperture, that's all up to you. Where that's nice is where this is beneficial in the manual control is that some people truly believe that when you've mastered your camera and you've become more attuned to it and you're familiar with its buttons and its layouts, it's very easy for manually for you to control and set things on your camera, and it might be faster or quicker to the jump than doing it through aperture or shutter priority would have been. There's a camera out there from Leica called the M series camera. The M11 is the newest model. They have the M11P. That camera has no automatic focus and only does manual. When you ask M users about that camera, one of the things that they'll say is that their manual focus for them is faster than if they were to let a regular camera that they own full manual or automatic focus for them. They've trained themselves, they've used this, they've done this so many times that they're able to navigate and maneuver their camera quickly. So you'll learn as you use things like aperture, shutter priority, that the things that you're controlling and doing as you practice and get better at it, you can easily do it at the same speed, if not faster, through the manual control. I know it sounds silly, especially as a new user who might be getting into this. You might be thinking I'm full of it, for lack of a better term. But I do mean that. The more you practice, the more you get into this, the easier these settings will become. I would give yourself a month, maybe 2 months. If you practice enough, you'll be able to do full manual control. Now, let's look at some images. This is one of my favorite parts of it. I'm going to speculate through looking at these images what controls the photographer was using. Now again, I don't have anything written down. I don't have a way of sitting there and saying, yes, that's the exact control they did. But what I want to really bestow upon to you knowledge-wise is that when you look at photos, this is how you should be thinking about what the photographer did. So many of your computers and your phone and even your camera, well, if you click on the info of that image, will tell you what the aperture, shutter, and ISO was. It's all embedded within the software and the programs of that file. But if you were just to Google some pictures and take a quiz online about what settings were being used on these cameras, this is kind of the thought process that I think you would have with it. And as a starting photographer, this might help you figure out maybe settings you need to use. So without further ado, I'm going to call out aperture, ISO, and shutter, and why I think that that is. Here we have a landscape photo. It's dark outside, but the lights coming from the windows are very washed out, very bright. Leads me to believe that it's a higher ISO to make out for how dark it is. That being said, I think that also, because if you look under the pillars on this, or where the bridge is, the bars are coming, you can kind of see some graininess and some pixelation. So I think the ISO got turned up a little too high. I want to say this is closer to 3200, and it doesn't need to be that high, maybe even a little higher. With the shutter speed, given that this is a still image, and given that their ISO is higher, they might want to pull more information from this. So I would at least say that if this is with a tripod or with something that's steady, you're probably at 1/100th of a second, maybe a little faster than that. Or sorry, a little slower than that. And then as far as your aperture is to be concerned, this is where I think that it really came into fruition that they use these numbers, because this looks like it's like that f/16, f/22. The background is in full display. The foreground is the bridge in front of us, and we're seeing that pixelation, that blurriness. We're also seeing the kind of the brightness of the windows. So I think that that aperture was so high that we had to overcompensate with our ISO and with our shutter. Here we have some cherry blossoms. The cherry blossoms, that branches in the front, is in full focus. The background itself has some blur to it, but not enough that we can't tell that those are more cherry blossom branches stacked on top of each other. So as a whole with the aperture, I probably would say this is closer to 1.4, maybe a 2, actually, no, sorry, I take that back, 2 to maybe a 3, or 2 to 4, just because you can see the background, but it's still blurry enough that you can't necessarily make out the finer details. ISO is probably low, 100 to 200, and unless these things are blowing extreme in the wind, shutter speed's probably slow. 1 2/50th of a second is kind of a standard, fast and slow, I would say, for most photos. Here we have 2 firemen, one standing in front of the other. The other one reminds me of the dog photo we just looked at on one of the other slides, where that face was blurred out in the background, but you could still tell it was a dog. So we know this is a fireman behind him. 5.6, 8 area, blurry, but not so blurry that we can't tell. On top of that, the ISO is probably going to be a little higher because the light feels warm, and it also feels like it's coming from above them. So I probably would put this at a 800 at the highest, maybe a little higher than that, 1,000. 1,600, probably no higher than that. I'm still sticking with 800. And shutter, unless they're walking fast towards us, I probably would say shutter's going to be a slower one, a slower one to begin with too. So 1 2/50th of a second, maybe a little bit slower than that, 1 1/50th. This is one that I like asking people about. If anyone who's been chatting wants to say it. But if you think this is stuffed or a real one, I think it's stuffed, something like you might see at the Field Museum or a Natural History Museum. So if I were to do this and I was thinking of that, the lighting is probably decent. So ISO maybe 400, 600, just seeing how much darkness is associated with this. You can see in the fur area. But that being said, there's a lot of detail and a lot of crispness to this photo. So the fact that they got all this info makes me feel like this thing can't move. That's why I think it might be stuffed. Aperture is probably going to be somewhere in that 3 or 4 ranges, 4 to 5, because you can make out the background slightly. It looks like snow, branches, cold, but you can't necessarily see what type of tree it is or what the branches look like or if there's any rocks in there or if it's just leaves. Who knows? Shutter though, again, if this thing isn't moving, 1 2/50 of a second mixed with everything should give us a lot of information. Maybe a little slower, 1/50 of a second. That's really pushing it. I think 1/50 could make sense because of how much detail we get on the horns and the fur. That would probably take a little bit more time for us to get. If this thing isn't moving, we have all the time to do that if we have stability or a tripod or something like that. Got some dogs in midair, some action photography. This is easily 1/1000th of a second or faster. That being said, it is going to be such a fast speed that our aperture needs to be jacked up, way up. So 1.4, 1.2 aperture is probably what we're looking at. And given how blurred out the background is, I don't think I'm wrong for saying something like that. Light is good, but we have a very fast shutter, a wide open aperture. So light, I probably would go at like a 400, maybe 800 maximum to help compensate with those higher numbers that we have for the aperture and for the shutter. But mix that all together and then it would hopefully get us this freeze frame of action. The image on the right always gets me so much because it's just such an intense movement in photo. When we talk about capturing motion, that dog is in the air. It's incredible, that image on the right. The image on the left is still great, but that image on the right, I mean, that dog is gone. It's incredible. And then here you've got the football player jumping into the end zone, scoring a touchdown. So it looks like they broke through some tacklers in the back end there, so you know that they were moving fast. So 1/1000 or faster on the shutter speed is probably what you're noticing with this. Then you want to look at the aperture on this one. The lighting conditions look fantastic. The back players are blurred out slightly, but you can still make out that that's number 6. You can still tell they broke a tackle and the guy's helmet and head are facing down. So in that case, I probably would put this at like a f8, maybe f5.6. That being said, enough light is being let in, even though the shutter speed is fast. So ISO, I probably would say 800, and if it was really bad and fast for that speed, 1600 at the most. Now, again, I hope that this kind of stuff helps make more sense of it, because within photography, this is the unfortunate reality of it, there's no right answer. You and I can take the same picture of the same thing, and I can use 3 different numbers that you're not using, and you can use 3 separate things that I'm not using, and we can still achieve a result of capturing an image that looks good. But the idea behind these numbers is that as you become more accustomed to it, and as you start controlling this aspect of photography more, you're going to notice the ability that you have and what you can change and what you can do to the photos to really make them pop and to be special. So again, are these numbers perfect? Probably not. But can they help you as a beginning photographer understand a little bit more about what to look for and what you might see as you're taking photos? I would hope so. Learning your camera is only the start. Anyone can learn to use a camera. I like to use the example of my grandmother. My grandmother was a smart woman. She's the best woman in my life. My grandmother has a tendency of one thing in one ear, out the other. I can sit there and tell her until I'm blue in the face how to do something, but she's so hands-on and tactical that until she does it, it's pointless. And I think for so many, photography is that same aspect. Keep in mind that what I'm teaching you is the bare, entry-level, bare bones things you need to know. What comes next is the practice, is the execution. Go out, take photos, enjoy the camera. We have about a month left of summer. September will be warm, but then October and the fall and the winter are going to click in. And before we know it, we're not going to be outside as much. We're going to be indoors more. So take advantage of the months that we have left of summer, how beautiful it is, and get out there, take photos, enjoy. To use your camera as a tool to capture the most beautiful moments that you can. My best accessories that you can do without spending money on it: practice. Set up a still life at home. Take your camera when you go pick up your kids from school. If you're walking your dog, take the camera with. Take pictures of what's around in nature. Classes. My class is completely free. There's tons of other photography classes and workshops that are out there where you can go and study with somebody, learn. And they love teaching. They do this for the heck of it. So it could be a lot of fun, and it could be definitely worth your time. YouTube is my favorite resource. Everybody watching at home on YouTube today, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. The store appreciates it. But YouTube offers you so much on there that you can learn. I redid my plumbing in my one part of my house all through YouTube. It's pretty incredible what you can do. Traveling is my other aspect. I leave for Spain in October. When I'm out there, you better believe I'm going to have my camera. If you're going anywhere, even just for a business trip, you should bring the camera with you. You won't regret it. If you do need to buy stuff, the top 4 are the things I recommend to every photographer, whether beginner or pro. Get a bag. Protect all of the equipment that you spent all this money on. Get yourself an extra battery and a memory card. Never hurts to have an extra on deck in case something fails. Lens cleaning kits are appropriate. They help clean your lens if you got smudges of dirt on it. Don't use your sweater or your shirt or your hoodie. Get yourself a nice camera strap if you don't have one. External hard drives are great to save your images and your work. Polarizing filters, ND filters. If you have questions on those, I'm more than happy to answer. And lastly, lenses. If you need to get the shot right, you're probably going to need to look into additional lenses with varying millimeter sizes and apertures to make sure you get the best quality possible. And that's all I have for you guys. This was the second Thursday of the month, meaning next Thursday is our third Thursday, and we're going to be doing advanced photography. So August 21st will be our advanced photography class. Anybody who has questions, feel free to chat and ask them now. I'll answer them live. I'll stay open for another few minutes here. If nobody's got questions, I'll log off. But next week, 5:30 to 7, we are going to be doing advanced photography. My goal is always hour of teaching. Give you 30 minutes. If you have questions to ask, go for it. If you don't, then I'll get off. All right, I waited a few minutes. Doesn't look like people have any questions. I don't want to keep everyone locked up here. Thanks for joining. Thanks for coming out. My name is Saxon. I'm your camera class host. I will be here again next Thursday from 5:30 to 7 to talk about advanced photography. As always, guys, keep taking photos. Keep doing what you're doing, and I'll see everybody next week. Keep shooting.